Our starter code today is the completed code for lesson 3, and that's available in the course resources for download or for cloning in Git. And what I'm going to do here inside of the package JSON now is create routing and controllers for both of those. So we're going to start with the user model today. I'm going to scroll down where we already have some routing, and you can see we are routing to the root file, and that is how we display that index page when we go to our local host and then port 3500, which we've done in previous tutorials. So now just underneath this, I'm going to have another app use, so app.use, and then I'm going to say /users. So this would be the endpoint, and if the request goes to this route, we're going to then require, and then we're going to look inside of the routes folder as we do with the one above, and then I'm going to look for user routes, which does not exist right now. So let's go ahead and go to the routes directory, and we can add this user routes.js file. So it's user with lowercase and then routes with a capital R.js. Now if we look at the previous file that we had inside of routes, which is root.js, we can see we required express and then created a router from express router. We will not need the path, but we do need these first two. So I'm just going to copy them and then go to the user routes file and paste these in. After this, we can do some preliminary setup here. So I'm going to say router.route, and now this will match the /users. So now we're saying we're already at /users, and now this is just the root of that. And we can chain different methods here. So what we're going to do is first say .get. So any GET request that comes to our REST API at /users, and then we would have a response we would put in here, which will direct to a controller. But we're not going to provide that yet because we haven't created it. So we're also going to look for a post method, and we could have a different controller or response for that. And then we could say patch. This would be related to update. So if you're matching these up to CRUD, get would be the read, post would be the create, patch would be the update, and then we'll have a delete method. Notice how all of these are truly chained together. We could put them in one line, but then once we started to insert our controller functions here inside the parentheses, that would become difficult. So I'd rather have them all on individual lines. After this, we just need to put module.exports, and we're going to say equals router at the end of this, and we'll save this for now. Now currently this won't do anything, so we need to create our user controller. So now in the file tree, let's make sure we're at the top level, and let's create another directory, and we'll call this directory controllers. Inside of this directory, we'll create a new file, and we'll call this users controller.js. Notice the lowercase and then the capital C on controller. We need to require the user model at the top of the file, so we'll say user equals require, and now we'll come up out of this folder and look in the models folder, and then we'll find our user model. And then I'm just going to copy this down with Shift Alt and the down arrow because we need to do the same for the note model. Even though this is the user controller, we may have to refer to the note model at some point inside of this controller. So we need both of those. And then I'm going to save because now we do need a couple of new dependencies. So let's go back to the package JSON, and I'll scroll so we can see our dependency list here. I'm going to open up the terminal window and pull it down so we can once again see our dependency list. And now we have two dependencies. So I'm going to type npm I express-async-handler, and then we also need bcrypt. And we can install both of those on the same line, just like that. And it shouldn't take them long to install, and we should see them both in our list of dependencies. So here we have express async handler, and then at the top we have bcrypt because these are listed in alphabetical order. So now let's go back to our user's controller file, and underneath the models that we have required, let's bring in these other dependencies. So let's say const async handler, and we'll set that equal to require, and this will be the express-async-handler. And then we'll say const bcrypt, and we'll set this equal to require bcrypt. And we'll need that to hash the password before we save it, because we don't want to just save a plain text password inside of any database. And the async handler will keep us from using so many try-catch blocks as we use async methods with Mongoose to save data or delete data or even find data from MongoDB. And now we can create our controller functions, and it is common to label those with comments. So I'm going to paste in the first label, and we'll follow this pattern for each controller function. But it has a description, and the description of this function will be to get all of the users. The route will be /users, and the method will be get, and the access to this route will eventually be private, but we're not setting up any authorization right now. We just want to get the REST API up and running so we can create the front end, and then we'll come back and lock it all down later. So we'll say const get all users, and we'll set that equal to a function that is async. Then we'll have a request and a response. Notice no next. The controller here should be the end of the line, essentially, where we're processing the final data and we're sending a response back. And after we do that, we have to consider something else. The async handler that will keep us from using the try-catch block and still catch those async errors needs to be wrapped around this function. So then we'll say async handler, and we'll put a parentheses there, and a parentheses at the end. Notice we haven't created the function yet, but I'm just going to leave it like this. I'm going to highlight this function, even though it's empty, and do Shift-Alt and the down arrow to create another one. And now we'll create our post. So this, instead of get all users, will be to create a new user, or just create new user to keep it brief. And this will be the post method at the same endpoint /users. It will also be private. So let's call this create, I get lowercase here, new user. And it will also have the async handler wrapped around it. So that's good enough to start out there. I'll once again highlight this, do Shift-Alt and the down arrow, and give another space. Let me scroll for just a little bit of room, and this will be to update a user. So we'll say update user, or I'll say a user, and then this will be the patch method, and it will still go to that same user's endpoint, and it will still be private. So now let's just change this to update user. And now one more time, I will highlight all of this, Shift-Alt and the down arrow, give a space, and this will be to delete a user. This will be the delete method. It will still go to the same user's endpoint, and now we can change this to delete user. And then we have our module exports at the very end. So I'll come down a couple of lines and type module.exports. We'll set this equal to an object that will contain all of these functions. So we'll have get all users, and then we'll have create new user, then we'll have update user, and finally we'll have delete user. And now all that is left is to actually create the logic inside of all of these functions. But before we do that, we can go back and complete our routes. So let's go back to the user routes.js. Inside user routes, let's import our users controller. So we'll say const users controller, set that equal to require, then 2 dots to come up out of this folder. We'll look in the controllers folder, and then inside of the controllers folder we have a users controller, and I should have just pressed tab right there so I wouldn't have to type it, but there we go, users controller. Now that we have the users controller, I'm just going to copy that users controller, highlight these parentheses here at the end, Control D to select all 4 of them, arrow to the end, and then 1 to the left to be in the middle, and paste, and I've got the user's controller now inside of each method. And now individually here we can use dot notation to pull in these methods, the functions that we created inside of the user's controller. So this will be dot get all users, and we can see that right there. And then we'll have dot create new user, and then we'll have dot update user, and finally we'll have dot delete user. And now our routing is complete and it's pointing to the correct method inside the user's controller for each one of these HTTP methods that could come into this user's route. So let's go back to the user's controller and make sure we're scrolled to the top. And now we'll start putting the logic inside of each one of these methods. Inside of get all users, I'll start by defining users, and then we will await, and then we'll take our user model and call the find method. And after the find method, we can chain a select here where we're actually going to say, please do not return the password with the rest of the user data. There's never a reason to send the password back to the client. After that, we also want to chain the lean method. Otherwise, Mongo would actually give us, or Mongoose, I should say, would actually give us a full document that has methods, including the save method and others attached to it, which is more than we need. Lean will tell it to basically give us data that's like JSON, and it won't have all of those extras. And especially when we're just getting the data and we're not going to call a save method or need that, that's the way to go. Okay, so then we need to check to see if we have users. So we'll say if we do not have users, then we're going to return a response, and that status is going to be 400. And then I'm going to chain JSON here and give a message and then say no users found. We could use an else here and then not use the return, because then we wouldn't have to say that's the end of the function. But I'm not using an else. Just after this, I'll say response.json, and there I'll send the users if we have the user. Another thing to note about this is if you have larger functions and several responses, I believe adding the return statement here is a little bit more of a safety feature. Otherwise, you could get an error about client headers already being set or something like that. And so I like to add the returns. Then, of course, at the end, the final one, you don't really need to. And some may prefer not to do that, but you could get in a bit of a problem with your logic if you don't literally end the function with a return statement. Okay, moving on to the next function, we have create new user. This is going to take a little more space, so I'm going to scroll it right up to the top if possible. And when we create a new user, we'll be receiving some data from the front end. So let's destructure that data from the request body. We'll get a username, a password, and a roles array is what we should be receiving. So we'll have to confirm all of that. We'll have request.body. We did set a default value for roles to have an array with an employee, but really we want to make sure they're set. So let's start out by confirming data. I'll say confirm data here. And now we'll say if there is no username, or there is no password, or let's use the array.isArray method and pass in roles. So if roles is not an array, that's an issue. Or we could say if roles doesn't have any length, so it's an array, but it doesn't have anything inside. Any one of those should cause us to reject what we have received. So then we want to say return response status 400, which is a bad request. And then we'll say JSON and have a message, and we'll say all fields are required. Now these are specific responses we are sending back for specific situations. If there are other errors inside of any one of these functions, then the error handling will take place, and our async error handler should kick that out, and it will go to our error handling middleware that we already have. But we don't always want that to be the case. Sometimes when we know we might get a specific response, we want to send that back, and we'll be able to show a message like all fields are required inside of our front-end application that will actually help the user. And now we need to check for duplicates. So we'll say check for duplicate, because we don't want to have two users with the same name. So here we'll say const duplicate, and we'll set this equal to await, and here's our user model. Now we'll use find one because we're passing in a username that we have received above as one of the things we received in the request body. And now after this, we need to use lean again because we're not going to call save on this duplicate or any of the other methods. But then we also need to call exec. And Mongoose really says if you're passing something in, not like we did with find above, let's look in this other one here, find, we didn't call exec, but we didn't pass anything in. And that's what I see in their documentation. But they're saying if you're using async await and want to receive a promise back, you really need to call exec here at the end. I do think it may work without it, but you do not get the error reporting either. And we could Google some more on that. I have read a couple of Stack Overflow reports as well, just to see what others were thinking along those lines. But I'm following the documentation, especially if there is any doubt. So that's what I'm looking at there. Once we have the exec added, we can say if we have a duplicate, if that's what we receive, if it finds one, then we're going to return response status 409, which stands for conflict. Then we'll have JSON, and this message will say duplicate username, which could also be very useful for our users. Okay, we're already getting close to the bottom of the page. I'm going to scroll up so we have some more room. And now we need to hash the password that we have received. So let's say const hashed password. We're going to set this equal to await and then use bcrypt that we have imported. Say hash, and now we'll pass in the password that we received from the request body, and we'll add 10 salt rounds to that. And you could look at the documentation for bcrypt if you're interested in that, but I can just put here as a note, salt rounds. That's what those are, and that's when it hashes the password. So I couldn't look at the database and know what your password is if I was the administrator. This keeps passwords secure even in the database. Even when they're seen, you won't know what the password is without decrypting it. So that's also very useful. Now let's define our user object before we save it. And let's set this equal to an object that has the username. Now we don't have to say username since the field in the database and the variable is the same. This is just like destructuring. We can just say username. But now I do need to say password, and I'm going to set this to the hashed password. And then we'll pass in roles, which is the same name, so just like username. Okay, after we've created that user object, we're then ready to create and store the new user. So let me put that note in here, create and store new user, and we'll say const user equals await user.create, and we pass in the user object that we just created. Now we can say if we have a user, so we've received that back, which means it was created. Then we can do something here, or we could have an else afterwards if not. So we'll say response.status 201. Notice I'm not using a return because I know I'm at the end here, and I'm going to use an if else instead. So message, and then I'm going to use a template literal, say new user, pass in the username value, created. And then after this, we'll have an else, and here we'll say response status 400.json, a message, and here we'll say invalid user data received. So that did not save. And we can save that, and we should be finished now with our create new user function. Now let's scroll up and add our logic for the update user function. It's going to have some similar logic to the create new user function that we have, but it's not the same, and it's not identical to where I wanted to create little helper functions along the way. So you'll just see some logic that is almost the same. First, we're going to bring in a little more data with this. So we'll be receiving an ID, a username, roles, an active status, and possibly a password, all from the request.body. After that, let's once again confirm data, but we've got just a little more data to confirm as well. So we'll have if there is no ID, or there is no username, or there is no array with our array.isArray, and we pass in the roles, or the roles.length is not there, or we have one more, type of active, which is the active status. Now we'll say not equal to Boolean. I'm going to press Alt-Z to wrap this code as well. So now we've checked all of the data, and if it doesn't check out, we will return res status and set that to 400, which is bad request. Then we'll have our message that once again says all fields are required. Let's hit return a couple of times and define our user. And we'll set our user equal to await user.findById, and now we'll pass in the ID, and we need to call exec at the end of this because we are passing in a value here, and we do need to receive that promise. After that, we're also not calling lean because we need this to be a Mongoose document that does have save and the other methods attached to it. So now that we are checking the user, we can once again say if we do not have a user, then we have a return response status 400 JSON, and our message is going to be user not found. Okay, after the user, I'm going to scroll up for some more room. We're once again going to check for a duplicate, but the logic is a little different. So here's our check for duplicate. We'll start out by defining our duplicate. Set this equal to await user.findOne, and we're passing in the username. And then after that, we need to go ahead and chain lean, as we do not need the methods returned with this, and we'll chain exec as well. And then let me put another note here, because this is where the logic is different. We want to allow updates to the original user. So if we just looked for duplicates and didn't allow an update at that point, it would also catch the current user we're working with. So we need to avoid that. So we'll say if duplicate and duplicate, I'll use optional chaining here and use underscore ID, which is the ID that's created by MongoDB. Now we'll send that to string, so we'll call the toString method, and if it is not equal to the ID that was received as a variable in the request body, then we have a duplicate. But if it is equal to that ID, that means we're just working on the same current user. So we didn't find a duplicate, we found the user that we're working with. So now let's say return response status 409 JSON with our message, and here this would be duplicate username. So we're trying to change a username to something else that already exists, and we do not want that. Now we're ready to update our user object with some of the information we have received. So we can say user.username. We'll set this equal to username. User.roles, we'll set this equal to roles, and user.active should be equal to active. Note that since this is a Mongoose document, if we tried to set a property that didn't exist in our model, it would reject it. So we can only do this with properties that already exist in our model. Now notice we didn't update a password because we don't want to require someone to always send in a password update when they update something else. So here we're just going to say if we have a password, then we can go ahead and update that password. And we're going to do that by hashing the password again. So I'll say hash password, and here this will be user.password is going to equal await bcrypt.hash, like we've seen before, pass in the password, and give it 10 salt rounds again. And I'll put that note here once again that those are salt rounds, and you can look in the docs for more details if you're curious about bcrypt. I need to scroll for just a little more room, but we're almost finished. We just need to say const updated user equals await user.save. Now this is where we absolutely needed that document, because if we requested the lean data in return, we would not receive that save method that we could call right there. And then of course, if there is a problem with that, this will be caught by the async handler, even though we didn't use a try catch. Now after that, we can send a response. So response.json, and then our message. And inside of our message, we'll use a template literal. And here we'll say updated user.username, and then we'll say updated. And we should be finished with our update user function. We are ready for the final function, which is delete user, and this should seem fairly easy compared to the last two. However, it's still got a little bit. We're only going to destructure the ID from the request body. That's all we really need to reference a user and delete that user. So we'll say if there is no ID, then we'll have that similar response. So return response.status 400, which is bad request, JSON, a message, and this message is user ID required instead of all data is required. If I could spell required, it'd be better off. And now we need to use the notes model because we do not want to delete a user if they have notes assigned to the specific user. So let's check the notes. So we'll say const notes equals await note. We've already imported that above, and we'll call find one again. And now here, each note in the note model has a user. So we'll pass in the ID, which should match that user ID. And then we need lean, as we won't be calling any methods, and we need exec at the end. After that, we'll say if the notes, and I will use optional chaining here, have length, then we'll go ahead and return response.status 400 for bad request, JSON, and the message that could help our users, which would be user, I need a capital U there, user has assigned notes. So we do not want to delete that user if notes are assigned to the user. Okay, after that, let's define our user, and we'll set that equal to await user dot find by ID that we have received, and we'll call exec after that because we do need those other functions, and we're going to actually delete instead of save this time. But we'll say if there is no user, then we need to send another response. So return response status 400 JSON, and now our message will be user not found. But then if there is a user is where we will be after this. Let's go ahead and define a result, and this result will actually receive the full user object that is deleted. And here we'll just say await user dot delete one, and when we do that, the user will be deleted, but the result will hold the deleted user's information. So now we can define a reply instead of sending all of that deleted user's information, which we could do. I'll just create this reply, and I'll use a template literal for that, and I'll say username. Here we can say result.username. After that, let's say with ID, and then pass in result._ID, and then we could just say deleted. So we have a message to send back. And now we'll just say response.json, and we'll send our reply. And that should finish out our delete function. With our controller functions completed, we now need to test them. And I'm going to do that with Postman. So we'll go to the postman.com website. I'm here at postman.com/downloads. And here you can download the Postman app. Postman lets us test each endpoint of our REST API and see the results without having a full front end, which can be very handy. So if you do not have it, go ahead and download and install Postman, and we'll come back and I will walk you through testing the endpoints that we just created. Okay, back in Visual Studio Code, I need to go ahead and start the development server. So I'm going to type npm run dev, and we should see everything start up, and it should say it's running on port 3500 and we're connected to MongoDB. With our dev server running, I now have Postman open, and we can click the plus symbol at the top to create a new workspace. I'm also going to press Control and the plus symbol a couple of times to get a larger font on the screen, as Postman defaults to a smaller font. And what we need to do is put in our dev URL at the top. So I'm going to put in localhost, and you can see it actually remembers what I've had in here before. So we want localhost port 3500, and then the user's endpoint. Now our user's endpoint has several possibilities. noise because we get different responses from each HTTP method that we send. So we have get, post, we're also going to send patch and delete, and we need to check out every possibility. And if we get a response that we don't expect, then we know we need to fix something in our code. And I'll give you an example of that. Right now we're at the get users endpoint. So we're going to send a request to users, and it's a get request, and it should return all of the users. But we don't currently have any users. But I'm going to go ahead and send this request, and we get an empty array. That was not what I expected. So let's fix that. We need to look in our code, and let's look at the get all users function that we have inside of our users controller. Now I'm going to close the terminal because it will continue to run even if we have closed the terminal. And now what we expected was this response here, no users found. But we had this happen. It sent the users anyway, and it was just an empty array. So what we really need to check here is if the users have any length. And by using optional chaining, we can first make sure that the users exist before we check the length property. So now let's save these changes, and let's check that request again with Postman. So I'll send that request, and now we get the response we expected. So now we'd like to also make sure this can return users, but before we can do that, we need to create a user. So let's check our post for the same endpoint, and now we'll need to send some data and create a user. So to do that, we need to go to the headers first, and let's add a header here in Postman that is content-type, and this will tell the server that we are sending application/JSON type data. So after we've added that, let's go to the body tab and let's choose raw. So we can just send some raw JSON here. So we'll have curly braces. Then we need to put quotes around the properties here. And we have a username. I'm just going to say Hank. After that, we have a password. And remember, this will be a plain text password here, but after the server gets it, it will encrypt it. So I'll put in a basic password. And we should also have roles. And roles is expected to be an array, and then there is string data inside the array. So with these three pieces of data, we should be able to create a user for Hank at the user's endpoint with a post request. Let's go ahead and send that. And it says new user Hank created. Great. So now we can go back and check our GET request for all the users, and let's see if we get Hank's information back. And we do. So you can see what was sent back. Notice the password is not here, as we told our code not to send the password back. So that also is working correctly. Let's see what else we need to check inside of Visual Studio Code. So for our get all users, we've already checked when no users are found, and now we've checked a response that sends any users that exist. So that's good. Let's move on to our create new user endpoint. And we made sure that it actually created a user, but now let's check if some of these other things happen. So we need to try it out without some of this data to see if we get the all fields are required message. We also need to try it out with duplicate data, which means we need to create another user and try to, or at least try to create one with the same name. So those are two possible responses. And then what else might happen? Okay, we might just create a user as we have, or if there was invalid data. And we could also just check to see if our async handler is working by sending some malformed JSON as well. So I think we'll be able to check everything except maybe the invalid user data, because we're already checking some of that before. So let's pull Postman up once again, and let's first check the duplicate. So we've already got a user named Hank. Let's just try to create another one at the post method, or at the user's endpoint with the post method. So I'll send this, and we've got the duplicate username response. So that's good. So if we change this to Dave, we won't have that problem. But let's go ahead and remove the username from the request, and now send the request. And now it says all fields are required. We could also verify that by removing a different one, such as the password. If we put it back, and maybe we remove roles, and let's try sending that. Now we have an unexpected token. So this checked our async handler because we had an extra comma here that it didn't expect since it was the last one. So let's delete that comma. We know our async handler is working, and our error handler was past this and sent it back to us. Now let's send this request. It still says all fields are required. Let's put the comma back, and we'll put our roles back, but we'll change the type of data. Let's say it's an empty array, and let's see if we catch that issue as well. And there we go. Let me send this. All fields are required is what it still says. So now what if it was just string data and not an empty array? So it didn't have the right data type. All fields are still required. So I'm going to minimize Postman again, and we'll once again look at our code. We checked the all fields are required. We checked the duplicate username. We definitely know we can create a user, and I couldn't think of any invalid user data to send that would get past the other checks. But if you think of something, go ahead and try that. And of course, we also made sure our async handler was catching errors, and it sent it on to the error handler for the entire server. So now we're ready to check the update user method. Again, we have all fields are required, so we need to check all of our data to make sure our confirmed data logic is correct. And then we also need to check the possibility of a user not being found when we're trying to update the user. And then we'll need to check for a duplicate, but we can't check for the same user that we're already working on because we want to be able to update that, and that's what we set our logic to. So we'll actually want to create another user and then try to change their name to Hank's name. And as I scroll down, let's see if there's anything else to check. Nope, now we should just be successful and send the response back. So we're checking for duplicates eventually, but also user not found and all fields required. I'll pull Postman back up. We'll now go to the get because I want to get all of the data that we have for Hank first. So we can just put that up above. And if we provide extra data, it won't hurt anything because we're only destructuring the data that we need when we send the request. And that's what the server is doing. Actually, those different controller methods, we're destructuring the data. So now I'm providing the ID so we can update Hank. But let's change one of the numbers here. Instead of this number 9, let's change it to a 1. And then we'll try to send the patch request, which would be the update. And let's see what happens. User not found. Well, that's what we expected. Great. So now let's remove the active that should be required, and let's see what happens. All fields are required. So that worked out as expected as well. Now this other logic was what we already had in there previously as well. So we had checked that with the other endpoints. So that should be good. But let's see if we don't supply an ID because we didn't have that before. Nope, it still says all fields are required. So just to confirm, I'll go back to the get and send, and I'll get Hank's number again, which I think I just changed the 9 to a 1, but I wanted to make sure I had that same 1. Now let's make sure the update actually works, and I'll just change active to false for Hank. So I'll come back to patch, and we'll send this, and now Hank was updated. So when we go back to get and send our request, we can now see that Hank's active status is set to false. And so now I need to create another user before I can try to rename and test the duplicate reaction. So what we're going to do now is go to the post request, and I'm going to change Hank's name to my name first, and we'll create a new user. So this should work. And it says all fields are required. What are we missing? Oh yeah, we didn't have a password because we didn't send a password along for the update. So let's just go ahead and add a password here as well, and I'll make it the same as Hank's too, as that won't hurt anything. And now I'll send the information for our new user, and new user Dave is created. So now if we look at the users, we should see that we have both Hank and Dave available here in our response. So I'm going to copy Dave's information and then pull the response back down, put Dave's information up here. Remember, we'll need to change this underscore ID to an ID. And now we're going to do a patch, and I'm going to try to change Dave's name to Hank. Now remember, we already have another user named Hank. So let's see what we get. Duplicate username. So that worked out just great. Now let's minimize Postman one more time and look at the logic for our delete method, our delete user here. And so we just have to send an ID, and if there's no ID, we should get a user ID required. Likewise, we're going to look for notes. Now, this is something we can't check. And as I'm looking at this a second time, I think this needs to be changed. Lowercase, we're really only looking for one note, first of all. So this is lowercase, and our model is uppercase, so they're not the same thing, even if they both say note. The second thing is, this probably won't return an array. We're using find one here, so I don't think that's what we want. If it doesn't find anything, it will be null, so we'll be checking that. Otherwise, it will have a note. So a nice little code review there. Now we also might get a user not found if we send an ID that doesn't exist, but we can't check this user has assigned notes now. We'll have to wait until we create the notes controller. So we're really just going to check to see if the user ID is required or the user is not found, and then we're going to make sure it can delete a user as well. It looks like I need to save that change, and NodeMon will restart our server, and now I'll pull Postman back up, and let's go to the delete method for the same user's endpoint, and now we're going to send some information. Now remember, this is actually user Dave. We tried to change the name. So let's not send the actual ID first. I'll change this 5 to a 1, and let's see if it can find a user. User not found. Great. So now let's try it without a user ID at all. User ID is required. That's what was expected as well. Now let's put in the accurate user ID. I'll change that back to a 5, and when I send, username Dave with that ID was deleted. So now let's go to the get request, get all of our users, and we still have Hank here. So let's go ahead and delete Hank as well, and our database will be empty once again. We'll pull this back, send, oh, that's the get request. We'll pull this back and go to delete, send the delete request, and now Hank is also deleted. So when we check the get request, we have no users found. And before you move forward with your controllers and the logic you have created for each function inside there, they would be the methods of the controller. You want to make sure you test every possible response that you expect to get, and then also check your error handling. And that's what we have done for the user's controller. And now I'll minimize Postman one more time, and we're back at Visual Studio Code. Now we still have a notes controller to create, and you have followed me for this process, starting in the server.js, where we created the route for the users, and then we went to the routes directory and we created user routes.js, and then we created the controllers directory and we added the users controller.js that has all of these different methods inside of it. So now I think it's a good time to issue a student challenge, because we need to do all of this for the note model as well. So we'll have our notes endpoint, and we'll have all of the associated controller methods with it. And of course, the routing needs to be put in place. I will leave that to you. I will provide my code inside of the course resources for this lesson. So if you want to check back, but I think it will be a great logic exercise, and don't expect to be perfect. There's no pressure. Just do the best you can. And then of course you can check your code with mine in the course resources.